My daughter sat at my kitchen table and wouldn't look me in the eye. We can't keep spending money on memories, Mom. 3 weeks later, my home of 42 years was gone. I had $4, 200 left, and an empty shop that smelled like dust and old regret. Everyone expected me to disappear quietly. I picked up a needle instead. 6 months later, the whole town stood up, and my daughter finally lowered her head. The white farmhouse on Willow Road with the porch that leaned slightly to one side no matter how many times Daniel fixed it. The paint that peeled every summer like it had somewhere better to be. My name is Cadence Ramirez. I'm 69 years old and I live in Maple Creek, Iowa. Before I tell you what happened after that kitchen table moment, I want to be honest about something first. I wasn't strong. Not at the beginning. I was just a woman who had run out of ways to pretend everything was fine. Daniel and I bought that farmhouse when we were young enough to think a leaky roof was an adventure. Raised Talia there, birthday parties in the backyard, with too many kids and not enough cake, sat around that scarred oak tables, through the good years and the ones that weren't. After Daniel passed, 7 years before all this, the house still felt full of him. His fishing hat on the mudroom hook, his favorite chair by the fireplace. Sometimes I'd be walking down the hallway and just stop, listening for boots on the floorboards that were never going to come again. The room I loved most was my sewing corner by the front window. Afternoon light came in perfectly there. Daniel built me a shelf for my thread jars, sorted by color, every single one. I kept baskets of fabric underneath, unfinished projects stacked in cedar chests throughout the house. Quilting was never just a hobby. People brought me their father's work shirts, their grandmother's aprons, a child's favorite blanket worn down to almost nothing. I stitched those things back together. When someone loses someone, sometimes a piece of fabric is the only thing left that still holds warmth. Did you ever make something with your hands that felt less like a hobby and more like keeping a promise? Talia used to sit on the floor of that room when she was handing me fabric squares, telling stories that made no sense at all. She believed every quilt had its own personality. Ah, I suppose I believed that too. Things shifted after she married Sawyer Bennett. He wasn't a bad man. I want to be fair about that. Even now, Sawyer grew up in a family that lost everything in a single bad harvest when he was 11 years old. His father never recovered from it. I didn't know that story until much later, and by then it had already cost me a house. What I saw at Sunday dinners was a man who looked at everything and quietly calculated what it was worth. Conversations drifted back to investment returns before the dishes were cleared. I noticed Talia going quieter around me, not all at once, gradually, the way a window fogs up on a cold morning. You don't see it happening until you can't see through it anymore. Did you ever watch someone you love start to disappear a little and spend months convincing yourself you were imagining it? The dinner happened on a Thursday in early spring. The daffodils were just starting outside the kitchen window. I'd made a pot roast way too large for 4 people. Old habit. When you've spent decades cooking for a family, you forget how to cook small. Sawyer placed a folder directly in front of me. Not beside him. In front of me. Neat, organized, printed pages with highlighted numbers. He talked about equity and market timing with the steady confidence of someone who had already decided how the conversation would end. The pot roast sat on my plate getting cold while he explained what my house was worth. Not our family home, not the place where Daniel painted the nursery before Ava was born. Just equity, just a number. I looked over at Talia. I waited for her to say something, pull it back to earth, remind her husband we were talking about a home, not a portfolio. Instead, she stared into her glass of iced tea. The ice had almost completely melted. I still think about that image. More than anything, Sawyer said that night. I folded my napkin, set it beside my plate, and I said no, not loudly, not dramatically, just no. He leaned back and sighed like I was being difficult. Then he said, and I don't think he meant it to cut the way it did, "A house doesn't love you back's Cadence." The room went quiet. I looked around my kitchen. The cabinets Daniel installed himself. The penciled marks on the door frame, where we measured Talia's height every birthday. The framed photo from our 25th anniversary. He was right, I thought. The house doesn't love me, but everything inside it reminded me of people who once did. I waited for Talia to say something. Anything. She didn't. That silence hurt more than anything, Sawyer said. What would you have done sitting at that table? Would you have fought harder than I did? I didn't fight hard enough. I know that. But grief does something to your capacity for battle. By the time that folder appeared on my table, I had $4,200 in a savings account, no pension to speak of, and a tiredness that was hard to explain to people who hadn't lived it. The sale went through. The investment happened. Then, faster than anyone expected, it collapsed. The project failed. Money disappeared. Investors pulled out. By then, the house was already gone. What surprised me most was how quickly people stopped talking about it. Life moved on, at least for everyone except me. There was an old sewing shop sitting empty on the edge of town. The owner had died years before. Through a complicated arrangement involving a distant relative and a short-term lease, it became the only place I could afford. $340 a month, which was just barely possible. The day I moved in, wind pushed dust across the floor. The front display window had a crack in one corner. The shelves were coated in years of neglect. An old sewing chair near the back wall had rust climbing up its legs. That first night, I heated soup on a portable burner and sat on an unopened box. The room echoed when I set down my spoon. I'd never noticed before how loud loneliness actually is. Has a place ever felt so empty that you could hear the silence, not just feel it? Some nights I'd park in the lot behind the building after dark and just sit there with the engine off, watching the glow from other people's houses, people eating dinner, watching TV, living ordinary lives. I felt like I had slipped sideways out of my own. Then there was the week nobody came at all. I had unpacked my sewing things, set up near the window, and waited. 3 days passed. 4. One afternoon, I drove home from a grocery run, sat in the parking lot, and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry since Daniel died. Not from sadness exactly, from the particular shame of wondering if you'd been foolish enough to believe in something that nobody else cared about. I gave myself 10 minutes. Then I went back inside. Then one afternoon, while clearing space near the back wall, I noticed an old wooden cabinet buried behind a stack of forgotten shelves. The doors were swollen with age. One handle was missing. I don't know why I kept looking at it. Something just wouldn't let me walk past it. I had to brace one foot against the wall and pull twice before it gave way. A cloud of dust drifted into the afternoon light. Inside were at least a dozen boxes, some stacked neatly, others shoved in like someone's last hurried act before closing up for good. I carried the first one to the table by the window. Inside were fabric bundles wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, unfinished quilt tops, handwritten notes, small tags on fading string, some dated more than 30 years back. One box held only carefully folded squares and a single envelope. The paper was brittle with age. The message inside was one sentence. Please don't throw these away. Someone loved them once. I must have read 10 times. The shop had belonged to a woman named Eleanor Whitmore. Most people in Maple Creek had barely thought of her in years. But standing there holding her handwriting, I felt like she was talking directly to me. What do you think Eleanor hoped for the day she wrote that note and closed those cabinet doors? That evening, I unfolded her first unfinished quilt. Corners loose, a section with water damage, stitching incomplete. It would take real hours. And for the first time in months, I found myself actually looking forward to the next morning. Work gave shape back to my days. Coffee at 6, unlock the door, sit beneath the cracked window while sunlight crawled across the floorboards. Little by little, the quilt came back to life. A week in, Martha Jenkins stopped outside while I was sewing. She'd lived 3 streets over my whole life, moving a little slower these days, carrying a grocery bag. She stood in the doorway watching for a few minutes without saying anything. Then left. The next afternoon, she came back with a cardboard box. Inside was a quilt that had belonged to her mother. Seams split, border worn thin. She ran her fingers across the fabric and told me it was the last thing she had, that still smelled like home when she was a little girl. When I handed it back 2 weeks later, she started crying before she even got it fully unfolded. What would it mean to hold something that smelled like home from 40 years ago? She told someone. They told someone else. People started showing up. A widow with her husband's flannel shirts, a veteran with his grandmother's quilt, a young father carrying a blanket made from his late wife's maternity clothes. Every single one of them holding something they couldn't quite put into words. I stopped charging older residents. Most were on fixed incomes. Many just needed someone to treat their memories like they mattered. Around then, Ava started coming by after school. Talia's daughter, my granddaughter. At first, she just sat near the front window scrolling her phone. Then one afternoon, she looked up and said, out of nowhere, "Why do people cry when they get these back?" They already knew they had them. I didn't have a quick answer for that. I thought about it for a moment, because having something and having someone take care of it, those are two different things, I finally said. She went quiet. Then she put her phone in her backpack and asked if she could help. Those afternoons became my favorite days. Slowly, the shop changed. Cleaned shelves, fresh curtains, a secondhand coffee maker that someone just left on the side table one morning without a word. People started lingering after dropping things off. Conversations stretched longer. The building stopped feeling abandoned. It felt needed. Can you remember a place that was transformed simply because people kept showing up to it? A man named Ben Holloway came in one Thursday morning, said he worked for the Maple Creek Gazette, and asked if he could hear some stories. The article ran that Sunday. The headline called the shop a place where family history is being stitched back together. I was embarrassed reading it. Everyone else seemed to love it. A month later, the Maple Creek Heritage Committee invited the shop to be featured at Heritage Day. So that's how 40-year-old fabric and one woman eating soup on an unpacked box ended up meaning something to an entire town. Heritage Day arrived under a clear blue Iowa sky. Dozens of restored quilts hung from wooden frames across the community center lawn, some vivid with color, others faded by generations of hands. Each one had a small card. Each card held part of a story. When the Heritage Committee asked me to speak after lunch, I had a few notes, just a short thank you, nothing fancy. But before I could start, Martha Jenkins stood up. She told everyone about her mother's quilt. Then someone else stood, a veteran, a widower, a young father whose daughter now slept every night under a blanket that connected her to a mother she barely remembered. I just stood there at the microphone while story after story moved through the crowd. Nobody talked about me. They talked about people they'd lost, things they thought were gone. I realized then, the quilts were never the point. They were just the bridge. Then Ava stepped forward. The crowd went quiet. She looked nervous. She gripped the microphone stand with both hands, and for a second I could see her trying to remember what she'd planned to say. She said that before the shop opened, she thought quilts were just old blankets. A few people laughed. Then she looked straight at me. She said, "My grandma taught me that the way you treat someone's old things tells them whether you think they matter." She paused. And I think a lot of us forgot she mattered for a while. That was it. No big speech. Just a 16-year-old telling the truth in front of her town. Across the crowd, I saw Talia lower her head. Sawyer stood beside her. For the first time since everything happened, neither of them looked defensive. They just looked honest. The applause started somewhere in the back, then it spread. People stood, nearly the whole square. After months of feeling invisible, I finally felt seen. Is there someone in your own life you may have accidentally stopped seeing? Talia found me later that evening, folding display cloths into bins while the last of the sunlight slipped behind the buildings. She apologized. Not perfectly, just honestly. She said that somewhere along the way, she'd started measuring everything through Sawyer's fear, and she'd let it become her own. She talked about the night I'd walked in on the bills, the past due notices, Sawyer's face. She said she'd been too ashamed to call me. I listened. Then I told her the thing I'd spent months learning. Fear explains choices. It doesn't erase them, she cried. So did I. But I didn't offer to fix their financial mess. Some consequences belong to the people who made them. That's not cruelty. That's just how learning works. Sawyer found steady work eventually. Not impressive work, just honest work. The debt didn't vanish overnight. They rebuilt slowly, just like I did. 6 months after that first night, with the soup can and the echoing room, the shop had a new sign. Quilt, House Community Studio. Retired quilters teaching teenagers. Veterans repairing heirlooms while sharing stories nobody had thought to ask them for in years. Neighbors who barely knew each other's names becoming friends. Ava runs half the place now, better than I do. Talia comes by sometimes. Not every week, not always comfortably. Some wounds take longer. We're not the family we were, but we're something more honest. Most evenings, I'm the last one to leave. I walk through the rooms, turning off the lamps one by one. Folded fabric on every table, coffee pot empty. The voices from the afternoon classes faded into quiet. Before I lock the door, I stop for just a moment. Not because I'm afraid of losing it anymore. I'm not. I just like looking at Eleanor's cabinet, still standing in the back corner. Both doors open now, empty, waiting to be useful again. Has there ever been a moment in your life when losing something led you somewhere you never expected? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, there's another one coming next week. A woman who walked away from everything at 63 and found out exactly who she was. You might not want to miss it.